Can an assassin change the fate of a nation with a single act? The 14th of July, 1584, Delft's main square was bustling like never before. Thousands of people gathered, jostling each other to witness a scene of cruelty, the likes of which the Low Countries had never seen. In the middle of the crowd, a 27-year-old man was tied to a torture stake. His legs were burned to the bone by red-hot irons. His skin was ripped to shreds with glowing pincers, and 4 horses awaited the final signal to tear him apart while he was still alive. His name was Balthasar Gérard, and 10 days earlier, he had committed an act that would forever change the course of European history. He had assassinated William of Orange, considered the father of the Dutch nation. But who was Balthasar Gérard, the man who would become the most hated murderer in the Netherlands? How did a fanatical Catholic infiltrate the inner circle of the leader of the Dutch independence movement? And why did his execution become the most gruesome and elaborate spectacle Europe had ever seen in the 16th century? To better understand Balthasar Gérard's obsession, we must go back to the dark days of the Spanish Inquisition. Balthasar, born in 1557 in Vouy, France, Franche-Comté, grew up in a deeply religious family where the Protestant Reformation was not only considered heresy, but also a direct threat to Christianity. From an early age, Balthasar was educated by Jesuits in fanatical ideas, teaching that Dutch Protestants were agents of the devil, and that rebellion against King Philip II of Spain was a crime against God. They asserted that any action to destroy these heretics was not only justified, but also a sacred duty. These ideas were deeply ingrained in Balthasar's mind, making him vulnerable to future extreme actions. Balthasar Gérard was not just an assassin, but a man so deeply possessed by his religious convictions that he was willing to sacrifice everything to fight what he perceived as a threat to his faith. In Balthasar's mind, there was an enemy he could not forgive, a figure whose every action challenged the authority of God and the Church. William of Orange, also known as William the Silent. William was not only the leader of the Dutch rebellion against Spain, but also became the symbol of a new religion, Protestant resistance. For fanatical Catholics like Balthasar, he was not just a political rebel, but the personification of the Antichrist, a man who threatened to destroy the true faith. And this drove Balthasar to commit an act that history will never forget: the assassination of one of the most powerful figures in Europe at that time. In 1580, in the tense atmosphere of a Europe divided by religion and power, King Philip II offered a bounty of 25,000 gold escudos for the head of William of Orange, a sum that would have made anyone who received it a millionaire for life. For fanatics like Balthasar, however, the sum was more than just gold. It was a seductive invitation, a sacred opportunity to have all their sins forgiven, to be forgiven and redeemed by God, with the blood of someone they considered a heretic, an enemy of the faith. A forgiveness that was not merely spiritual, but an absolute power, allowing them to act without fear of punishment. Over the years, other bounty hunters had tried, but only Balthasar was truly obsessed with this goal. With each failure of others, his determination only grew more fanatical. He wanted not only to kill William of Orange, but also to kill him, Orange. He wanted the act to be a curse, an indelible mark on history, so that people would remember that this death was not the end, but the cleansing of sins, an act of worship in the dark. William's death would be a sacrifice, an event that would not only destroy people but humiliate all the values his enemies stood for. Balthasar had spent years studying, planning meticulously like a spider spinning a web, living in the shadows, moving silently through Protestant circles, building a reputation as a sincere convert and a silent fighter against Spain. Step by step, he approached the nobles, fabricating a story of a French noble who had abandoned everything to serve the Dutch cause. No one suspected him. With each passing month, he became more elusive, like a ghost waiting for his chance. And when Balthasar finally had his long-awaited meeting with William in the land of Orange at Prinsenhof, he did not come just to kill one man. He came to make his mark in history, to bring an unforgettable death to a man he considered an enemy of the gods themselves. Can you imagine the stress and risk of having one of the most prominent leaders of a nation assassinated in his own study? On the 10th of July, 1584, William of Orange woke up in his palace in Delft, unaware that he had only a few days left to live. At 51 years old, he, known as the father of the Dutch nation, bore the burden of 16 years of brutal warfare against the Spanish Empire. Deep wrinkles and bruises around his temples were clear signs of decades of fighting for his homeland's freedom. That morning, William was particularly concerned about reports that Spanish troops were massing near the border. Any information about the enemy's movements could be decisive in defending the Dutch cities. When his advisors informed him that Francois Guilland, a French nobleman, had new information about military operations of Spain, William immediately agreed to meet him. In the middle of the afternoon, Balthasar, dressed simply but still elegantly like an aristocrat, arrived at the Prinsenhof. He was carrying a small leather bag that Balthasar said contained maps and military documents about Spain. However, in the bag were 2 loaded pistols, the weapons that Balthasar would use to carry out his mission. The meeting took place in an intimate atmosphere in William's study, where he often discussed important matters in private. He was accompanied by only his secretary and a guard. The low level of security reflected William's trust in the loyalty of his subordinates. For nearly an hour, Balthasar played the role of Francois Guilland to perfection, discussing military strategies and even theological issues with William. The Dutch leader was impressed by the young Frenchman's knowledge and dedication to the war, independence. When William stood up to study a map that Balthasar had brought with him, the assassin saw his opportunity. As William turned, bending over his desk, Balthasar quietly pulled a pistol from his pocket. "For the glory of God and the Catholic King," Balthasar shouted and shot William in the back. The bullet pierced the Dutch leader's lung and heart, sending him falling onto the desk, blood pouring from his mouth. Before anyone could react, Balthasar pulled out a second pistol and fired again, ensuring that his victim was dead. The secretary and the guard, paralyzed for a few seconds, were unable to react. This gave Balthasar enough time to make an escape, but his plan was ineffective. The palace stairs were quickly blocked by guards who heard the gunshots. Cornered on the second floor of the Prinsenhof, Balthasar attempted to jump out of the window but fell heavily and broke his leg. Balthasar's arrest caused an unprecedented wave of anger in the Netherlands. William of Orange was not only a political leader, but also a living symbol of the Dutch people's struggle for freedom, revered as the father of the nation. His assassination was not only considered a serious crime, but also a blasphemy against the nation. Angry crowds surrounded Prinsenhof, demanding immediate justice. Guards had to form a protective ring around Balthasar to prevent him from being hanged on the spot. The assassin's screams echoed through the streets of Delft as news of the crime spread rapidly throughout the city. Balthasar's interrogation revealed the religious fanaticism in his mind. Under torture, he confessed his true identity, stating that he had spent years planning the assassination, motivated by religion. Instead of repenting, Balthasar proudly declared that he had fulfilled a divine mission given to him by God, which was to destroy the enemies of the Catholic faith. The Dutch authorities decided that Balthasar's execution would not be a mere death sentence, but would be a public spectacle to serve as a warning and deterrent to future assassinations. and to satisfy the people's thirst for revenge. His death would not be a quick one, but a demonstration of justice that would last for hours, involving every form of torture imaginable under contemporary law. To what extent can a man be driven to commit a heinous act, only to end his life in a death more cruel than the crime itself? On the 14th of July, 1584, the death of Balthasar Gérard, the assassin of William of Orange, was not just an execution, but a torture drama meticulously choreographed to cause extreme pain, not only physical but also mental. Under the scorching sun of a Delft morning, the main square had transformed into a theatre of death, where the instruments of torture were neatly arranged, awaiting the start of an unimaginable ritual. Red-hot pincers, molten irons, ropes and horses were carefully prepared to tear the body of the condemned man. Balthasar, after weeks of imprisonment and interrogation, still maintained a defiant expression. Before the furious crowd, he did not kneel to beg for mercy, but only prayed in Latin, believing that his death would send him to heaven as a martyr of the Catholic faith. Painful and gruesome, the execution began by setting Balthasar's feet on fire, the hot flames scorching his skin, while the smell of burning flesh filled the air. But that was only the beginning of a death ritual designed to prolong the pain. Next came the glistening pincers, piercing through each layer of flesh, tearing them from his body, amid screams of anguish that not only sent shivers down the spines of onlookers, but also evoked the sick satisfaction of the crowd who stared at the horrific scene. For hours, Balthasar was tortured to an unimaginable degree. The executioners were artists in their sadistic craft, knowing exactly when and how to make him suffer without dying. The actions that followed were almost unbearable, and as his body was cut into pieces, blood spurted out from the wounds that were still alive. The crowd only waited for the final moment, when he really stopped breathing. It was the moment of brutal finality, and when Balthasar's heart stopped beating, the crowd's bloody celebration rang out. But his death was not simply the end. It became a symbol, a warning to those who dared to resist, but also a paradox, when his death ignited a flame of resistance stronger than ever. Balthasar Gérard, an assassin, had now become a martyr in the eyes of the fanatics. Balthasar's death not only ended his story, but also opened a new chapter in history, a chapter where the death of a man was not only cruel to himself, but also reflected the cruelty of a fanatic society. His image, though torn apart, lives on in stories, in songs, and in the memories of a world that has never completely free from the ghosts of the past. The life and death of Balthasar Gérard should make us ask, can hatred, especially when fueled by fanaticism, turn an ordinary human being into an instrument of ruthless violence? Such painful and gruesome images, though etched in history, are dark reminders of the destruction we, in our blind faith, can bring upon ourselves. Balthasar Gérard, the man who murdered William of Orange, did not become a hero or a soldier fighting for a noble cause. Instead, his death, burned at the feet, flayed, and torn apart in a public execution in the middle of a public square, left behind only a cruel scene, one that even the executioner could not escape the stain of. This is not just the story of a traitor, but a warning about the dangers that hatred and religious hatred can bring. The price of fanaticism, for both the assassin and the victim, is immeasurable, and it destroys not only the body, but also the soul. When hatred replaces humanity, there is no winner, only destruction and pain that lingers throughout history.